So, good evening. Welcome to Europe House. Fáilte roimh go léir chuig áras na Horpa. Buenas noches, bienvenidos a Casa de Europa. You're very welcome for this evening of poetry and reflection on poetry's place, and in particular with a focus on what's described as European lesser used languages, and of course that's a term that can evolve over time as lesser used become more used. It's something I was saying when I was talking to our poets, our panel earlier. I've been 28 years living in Brussels, also a bilingual city, although that's not necessarily very widely known, and in working for the European Parliament, and just returned here a year ago. And one of the things that I found a pleasant surprise was I perceived at least a growth and a resurgence of the use of an teanga náisiúnta, an teanga Gaeilge, the Irish language, coming back, and I've started to practice my own after 28 years again, so it's nice to have that opportunity. And I was looking a bit earlier at it's actually a Council of Europe document as opposed to European Union, but it's very much supported in the ethos of the European Union, the Charter of Regional and Minority Languages that you'll all be familiar with. And it talks of protecting and promoting, and it refers to, you know, Europe's cultural traditions and heritage, and talks about in public and private life, and the kind of things that are encouraged are transnational exchanges, you know, which is something that we have here too. And I think that's important to emphasize this sort of multidimensional aspect, because languages are very personal, you know, they go to the core of our entity, of our existence, and so it's very important that people, you know, recognize that as part of people's identity, and they have that freedom, and it's encouraged that they can live out that identity, that core part of their being to the full. But there's also a sense in which, you know, it's part of the broad cultural heritage that the whole of society needs to cultivate and maintain. And I think in that sense, you know, Europe has a motto, European Union has a motto, we're 27 member states united in diversity. And that diversity includes linguistic diversity. I work for an institution, the European Parliament, that has 24 official languages, agus an Gaeilge in a mask, and Irish wasn't from the beginning an official language. It took until 2007 for Irish to become an official language, because the Irish government, in joining in 1973, didn't request it, actually. And maybe that's an evolution of self-confidence and you know, the value that is put on language, and it's now on Príomh teanga náisiúnta. It's now the first national language here. So that's a little bit of where I'm coming from, and I'm very pleased to have this event here, and I'm grateful once again to Catriona here, who's curated our whole series of talks, great variety of topics and issues, and it's lovely that we have this one. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Catriona, who's going to actually introduce and present each of our poets, our panelists. Gurmina Mahagwif.
Thanks very much, Fergus, and we greatly appreciate your attendance at all of these talks every week, and your words before they start. So our spring talks often focus on very grim topics, necessarily given the current state of the world. I turned on my television when I came home this afternoon to see Donald Trump holding a cabinet meeting. And in the course of that, what he was talking about was the guy he hates, Mr. Powell, who runs the General Reserve. And he went on for a good 20 minutes about how he's spending $4 billion on restoring the General Reserve building. And I thought, Would somebody not tell him to shut up? Like, how is it? He goes on like this at every cabinet meeting, and these people sit around him and listen to him talking absolute nonsense. If it was anywhere else, he'd be taken away in a white coat immediately. That isn't poetry, but what he's doing is the opposite of poetry. Let's put it that way. Our two previous talks this month dealt with digital threats to children, very important issue, and the ever-contentious issue of Irish neutrality. But we cannot live without culture, and tonight's event should gladden our hearts. There is a multiplicity of so-called minority languages among the members of the European Union, including our own, Irish. Many of them come with a history of suppression and/or persecution, as ours does. Membership of the EU has improved matters for these languages and their speakers and champions through two mechanisms, as Fergus told you: the Council of Europe's European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, an international convention rather than direct EU law, and Article 22 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, ensuring linguistic diversity, prioritising non-discrimination and promoting the use of these languages in public life. We've seen a welcome resurgence in Irish here over the last few years. When I went to school, Irish was taught badly and most of us hated it. The pious attitude of what used to be called Gaeilgeoirí didn't help. There was a lot of piety and conservatism surrounding the Irish language. In the 1960s, the last thing we wanted was pious conservative people telling us we had to speak Irish. So it did, whatever suppression and persecution we suffered under the British was replicated to a certain degree by the Gaeilgeoirí under the Free State, who, instead of saying the language is a beautiful and wonderful cultural jewel, thought that they could bring it back as the spoken language of the country. The jig had been up since the early 20th century. It just wasn't going to be possible. We should have celebrated it as a cultural treasure instead of trying to ram it down people's throats. But that's all changing now, and it's not just because of NECAP. The language is taught much better. We've had a huge growth in Gaelscoill now, which is actually one of the huge success stories in education. And that has been a voluntary bottom-up movement from parents who are supported by the state because, again, this is one of the objectives of the state, to make the Irish language more widely spoken. But I have a niece who went to a Gaelscoill who did not have a background in the Irish language and who loved it and did really well there and cherishes the language as a result. And there are lots of children now going to school in that way and loving it. And the general culture has made Irish hip rather than dreary. Irish traditional music is thriving. And if anyone goes into the Cobblestone, they're going to hear some beautiful Irish language sean-nós singing. Dolores Kane, who died, alas, too soon, last week, was a magnificent sean-nós singer and brought it to a lot of people who might not otherwise have heard it. Now, poetry is one of the bastions of human consciousness. If there's an area where we could expect to find minority languages protected and explored, it's among poets. And we have three here tonight. Observe them. They are different beings to the rest of us. They think and feel differently to the rest of us. They are extraordinary. I have the great privilege to know quite a number of poets, and I can tell you they're a different lot. They're from another planet in the most wonderful way. So it's a great privilege to have these three wonderful people here with us tonight. They're going to enlighten us on the issues, delights, and problems associated with working in these languages, particularly Gallego, which I'm dying to hear some of. We'll have to get a good blast of Gallego from you, Martín. Usually these languages, of course, occur alongside another more dominant language, and that will be one of the issues they're going to discuss. So I'm going to introduce all three of them so they can jump straight in. Keith is the sort of de facto boss of the evening, even though he has plenty to say for himself, and so he won't just be asking questions, he'll be also telling us about his own work. But will we start with Annemarie Ni Churreáin, who is a poet from the Donegal Gaeltacht. Her third poetry collection, Hymn to All the Restless Girls, what a beautiful title, published by the Gallery Press in 2025, appears in the Irish Times Best Poetry of 2025 and among the RTE Culture Best Irish Books of the Year. She is a recipient of the Arts Council Next Generation Artist Award, the Markievicz Award, and the Patrick Kavanagh Fellowship. As a librettist, she has worked on The Curing Line, a new award-winning opera by Michael Gallen. Ni Churreáin is a recent writer in residence at the Hawthornden Foundation in New York, and she is the poetry editor of the Stinging Fly magazine. For those of you who know poetry, that is the Irish equivalent to being the poetry editor of the New Yorker. So she's very important. Martín Veiga is a Galician translator. He's on the right of Annemarie there. is the author of 11 collections of poetry in translation and original poetry. Most recently, am I right? Oh no, I'm reading you. Sorry, the brain is disintegrating with old age and being driven mad by Donald Trump. Blame him. Martin is a Galician poet, translator, and senior lecturer in Hispanic Studies at University College Cork, where he's also the director of the Irish Centre for Galician Studies. He has published 6 award-winning poetry collections in Galician, including Diario de Crosses Green, am I right? If I get the pronunciation wrong, hop off me, published in 2016, and A Ganancia e a Perda, published in 2020, and the bilingual anthology Jewels in the Mud, Selected Poems 1990 to 2020. Is that a reference to T.S. Eliot, Diamonds and Sapphires in the Mud? Great, I'm glad I spotted it. In 2023, he published the first Galician translation of T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets, where indeed that phrase appears. My favourite book of poetry of all time, by the way, so wonderful that you've done it. His main research areas are contemporary Galician and Irish poetry, literary translation, eco-criticism, and travel writing and mobility narratives in the Iberian context. Recent publications include the co-edited volumes A Different Eden, Eco-Poetry from Ireland and Galicia, published in 2021, and Here and Beyond, Narratives of Travel and Mobility in Iberian Culture, published in 2022. And Keith Payne, our boss for the evening, is the author of 11 collections of poetry in translation and original poetry, most recently Savage Acres, published by the Daedalus Press in 2025, and Building the Boat, published in 2023. Whales and Whales, from the Galician of Luisa Castro, was published by Skene Press in April 2024. He was Red Line Book Festival Writer in Residence 2020, John Broderick Writer in Residence 2021-22, awarded an Artist in the Community scheme for Tales My Granny Told Me for his work with Direct Provision Residents. Very interesting work, I would imagine, Keith. Was Cork City Library Eco-Poet in Residence 2022-23 and serves on the board of the Cork World Book Festival. He was awarded an Arts Council Literature Bursary in 2022. Having run La Malinke Readings Ireland Galicia since 2016, he founded and curates the A. Rua O'Donnell Poetry Exchange Ireland Galicia in association with Literature Ireland, Poetry Ireland, and the Tyrone Guthrie Centre in Annemarie, as well as a number of international funding bodies in Spain. He was co-founder and director of the Poem Aria International Poetry Festival 2016 to 2019. A long-term poetry editor and poetry mentor, he has taught creative writing and poetry and translation workshops at various universities, most recently Queen's, Oxford, the Trinity Centre for Literary and Cultural Translation, the British Centre for Literary Translation, the Seamus Heaney Centre, Queen's, Belfast, and the Universities of Oviedo, Santiago de Compostela, and Salamanca, among others. So I'm going to leave the 3 of you now to mesmerise us with your views on these interesting matters. Thank you all for coming. And thank you all for coming this evening. You are a select few. Rejoice in that.
Yes. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Catriona. And welcome to the respite from football. We hope it'll be far more, it'll be far deeper at least. I'm exhausted listening to those bios. Like, where did all that work get done? About 50 years ago, give or take, quite nearby here from the stage of the Abbey Theatre, Michael Hartnett, one of our great, great, great poets, and still is, announced that he would no longer write in English. And being Michael Hartnett and being a poet, he did so with a book, which was called A Farewell to English. And there's so much that's quotable from that, but one particular set of lines that is often brought out is poets with progress make no peace nor pact. The act of poetry is a rebel act. Now, I want to take that phrase today and slightly turn it into poetry as a radical act. Why radical? Well, radical from the Latin radicalus, meaning rooted, meaning of or having roots, going back to the Indo-European vrad, also meaning rooted. So poetry, we shall see today, especially with Annemarie, August, Martín, is a deeply rooted act whose branches reach far, far beyond their place of origin, shall we call it. we look at that between the idea of place, the idea of place, the idea of community. We'll also question maybe, what are we talking about here today? There's many phrases used. Minority languages, minoritized languages, which is the favorite term in Galicia, for example, lesser used languages. I'd like to propose that we think today of languages of minorities. It's a far more inclusive term. Poetry itself is a minority. And so if we think of just languages of the various minorities, urban minorities, grouped minorities, preference minorities, also linguistic minorities. And so today we're going to listen in, we're going to tune in to all those variations, but returning constantly to the rootstock of place, where the poetry grows from. And so I'll start this as where we tend to finish, which is with a poem. This is a translation of a poem by Olga Novo. I'll read you this poem in English and we'll hear it in Gallego later on. And then I'll hand you over to Martín and Annemarie for their opening comments. And then we'll dive straight into the conversation for about 40 minutes, give or take. And then we'll open it up to some Q&A afterwards. So this is Olga Novo. Olga is addressing her daughter, who she's carrying at the time. And it's called Song of the Intraurine Cradle. And she asks, can you also hear them as you sleep in me? Do they untwist their voices from the trees and come whisper to you of what's on the underside of life? Can you also hear them trying to slip from the alder leaf, where they'd settled in this native limbo, stunning and vast as our delicate existence? Do they also speak to you, dragging their tongues through the mist, or from a sod crumbling under the light weight of the night and the past? Do they also speak to you of the ineffable, with such clarity it cannot be grasped? Can you also understand them when they rock you to sleep in me, and you become a part of them, although of them there's nothing left? You are loved by the shades. They can also hear you when you kick inside me in the yard, steered as you are by the hay, by the grasshopper, by the boundary stone that marks our sky. I think you listen entranced, waiting to be born, to see, to hear their invisible presence. Yes, it's the only true matter that can continue only in you. Olga Novo. And I'd like to hear from Martín Veiga, please. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. That was a lovely reading of... thank you, Catriona. That was a lovely reading from Olga Novo's poetry. She's a brilliant Galician poet, and Keith has, as he always does, done justice to her work through translation. As Catriona said, I work in Galician studies. I have been working in that area for a very long time. I am the first generation who received a formal education in the Galician language in school after the Civil War and the dictatorship. So I suppose I have that privilege of having not only lived through the language in my home and in my community, but also having received formal education in school, secondary school, and so on. So I think that is an important qualitative dimension, because when I was 11 years old, the language became official together with Spanish in the Galician context. Up to that point, it occupied a kind of an interregnum of negativity in many respects and of resistance. So we could say perhaps that the Galician language spoken in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula has a history as many other languages that have been dominated, a history of ups and downs and progress and regression, typically associated with the impact of history, I suppose. And in many ways, this has been kind of happening through the centuries, from the splendor of the Galician language that gave us the most magnificent fruits of poetry in the Middle Ages, to the decline of it in the 15th century, and the so-called dark centuries that went through the 16th and 17th century until it started to be kind of revalued again through a revival in the 19th century, only to then be neglected again by the Franco forces after the war in 1939. Up to that point, or from that point onwards, it was banned, and it pretty much disappeared from the public arena. It's a history of discontinuities and kind of neglect in many ways. When we talk about lesser used languages or minority languages or minoritized languages, I think this is all a matter of perspective, because in Galicia, the Galician is not a lesser used language. It's actually very much used by the community, particularly the community, the older community. So it's a language that is pretty much alive. It's not endangered, even though it is not going through its healthier figures around the younger population. So that is something that perhaps could be debated in the context of Irish experiencing that revival that we were talking about earlier. And it all comes down to, well, not all, but in many respects, political support, institutional support, and then social commitment and kind of engagement. Keith talked about place. My poetry is pretty much rooted in place or in places. My identity is now torn, like many others. I'm Galician, and I'm a writer who writes in Galician, but has been living in Ireland for more than 25 years. So it's a tricky situation to be in, like being a poet writing in a language that is not around one, and therefore feeling constantly the need to kind of reach out for the language in somewhere else. And one of those places where I reach for the language is often memory or memories, and so the poetry constantly goes backwards and forwards, looking for that connection with the language. So I'm going to start reading a poem that connects with that, and it's a poem that started one of my collections. It's published 20 years ago now, and it's basically a choir that is starting, and I start to hear the choir singing. So it's the beginning of the poetry. Palimpsesto. Escoito na distancia o coro que comeza solemne, aves nos cantís, as badaladas da igrexa. O coro que comeza semellante á chuvia que quedou nas arañeiras, envolta no silencio do entardecer. Esquiva. Ruínas dun tempo alén de min, fragmentos como o ceo grisallo nos areais de outono ou un xardín furtivo baixo o vento inclemente de xaneiro, despoxos que se perden por canteiras, lamazais bougos. Todo resulta semellante ao lene aroma da resina que se queima, transitorio, semellante a ese horror extraño. Farrapos, soidade, un tempo opaco, a vida imperfecta como unha frase inacabada, as celadas do amor, marmúrio de oucas, aquel verso incomprendido, o íntimo silencio, ruínas, teselas dun mosaico, abrétema, o coro que comeza, palimpsesto, periplo. We can talk about many things here, but in the context of the European Union, I think there's been a kind of a recent attempt to accept Basque, Catalan, Galician as official languages of the European Union that has found some resistance, and so we can probably talk also about those things in the context of European, because they are also, I think, important. And the European Charter for Regional Minority Languages is really a very well-intentioned document, but doesn't grant legal recognition to the languages. And I think that is also, from a qualitative point of view, important to take into account. Anyway, I don't want to get too political because that's not my area, but there are things that, for uses of the language, we always have to take into consideration, both personally and socially, I suppose.
Thank you. Thanks, Martín. Annemarie?
Thank you, Mara Dív, Tasha Galanta Venshaliv. Lovely to be sharing this space with you. As you were reading, Keith, I was thinking about the fact that we don't have a grand opera tradition in Ireland, but we have this wonderful tradition of the small back room. Yeah. And when I'm listening to you reading, sometimes I'm lured right into that back room. And wonderful to hear your reading and enjoy the sonic soundscape. So Annemarie Ni Churreáin is Annam Dhu as Tír Chonal me. I'm from northwest Donegal. I grew up there in the 80s under the kind of shadow of Errigal and looking out to Tory Island. And I grew up in the heart of the Gaeltacht in a place called Crocknaneo. Crocknaneo means Hill of the Saints. And if I were to look out my bedroom window as a child, I would see the exact spot where it said that Niamh Columkill stood to decide how he would convert the area of Donegal from paganism to Christianity. And I grew up there on Crocknaneo, really beautiful, kind of rugged, boggy place. And I think it's fair to say that the scent of something Christian was commingled with the sense of something deeply pagan and older than Christian. We were talking about poetry influences, and one of the biggest influences on me coming of age was Moa Harwar, Mary Haig. And Mary Haig had beautiful Belarus folklore. She had wonderful Pishruga superstitions, and she had a fantastic knowledge of old stories and tales. And she gave me a great love of Angelic. That is still a huge part of my life, and I might begin with a poem that weaves together the English language and my native language, which was my first language. The poem is written for my baby niece, who has emigrated to Canada with her family, and I was thinking about the loss of language for her, and I wanted to give her some words to take with her on that trip. Sea chest. Pay no heed to the gulls, or the fishy clouds, or the horned smells. Molyanu, molyak, you must be good for the ship, and make a fist of this berle with icy talk like Atlantic. though I have stashed your chest with kindling, moon-dried and fit for the blue snows of Canada. Jora J to light a fuchsia fire, Gyad to light the white star on a horse's head, Spalp to light a surprise kiss. To endure this wegness, remember you are not darkness. Darkness is but a passing shroud, night thin and leaf loose. Salt winds can lift it among the candling stars. My child sailor, take these arms wrapped in newspaper to outsail hunger.
Goeiedag. I'm going to follow that song line because how could you not follow it? That small back room, that lovely phrase comes from Kieran Carson, our great Kieran, who spoke. It's worth looking up the article. It's in the Irish Music magazine he used to write for. It's just called Small Back Room, and it would speak a lot as well to the internet conversation you had here during previously. Myself and Annemarie were down in Cork at the Cork Book Festival 2 years ago. And a word kept going around, which was encounter. People, instead of talking about gatherings or meetings or readings, people all week kept saying, that was a lovely encounter. That was a great encounter with this poet. And of course, being a poet, I ran the dictionary and chased the word encounter, which, as you go back, gives you enchanté in the French, or encantado in Gallego, lovely to meet you. And it also gives you enchantment, and to be enchanted. And you follow it back, you'll eventually arrive at the Latin cantare, to sing. And so a meeting, an encounter with somebody new or familiar is an enchantment through the song. And I think that's embodied, literally embodied, in what poetry is. So Annemarie, can I ask you first, growing up in the Gaeltacht, with your native language around you, writing in English, and now drawing back on that, very much rooted in place. Can you talk to us a bit of that experience?
Well, certainly Mary Haig, my grandmother, was a huge influence on me. She had been an immigrant to New York and had been back.
Okay.
And she had brought with her many stories that she had acquired on the road. So I had the blessing of growing up with stories of Balor na Sulnevne, Balor of the Evil Eye, stories of Lu Lavada, Lu of the God of Light, mixed in with stories of Kung Si, who is of the Chinese folktale, who had escaped her father on the eve of a wedding. And I got this beautiful meld of stories. And to me, that really is still the way I think of the Gaeltacht. It's to grow up in a place that is deeply rooted by word magic, deeply connected to the tradition of the filia, and a very songful place. But within that, I think, is somehow an international dream life, a universal dream life. It's an ecosystem of story and language that actually connects us into cultures around the globe. And I'm always interested when I meet poets who are Mojave or First Peoples or from indigenous cultures in the US, for example, because the love of ritual and ceremony and the place that language has in milestone events, all of that is deeply, deeply familiar to me. Now, I make growing up in Donegal sound like some spectacular coming of age. All the things we know about Donegal are true. It's a socio-economically disadvantaged place. It was not glamorous in the 80s. I had a father who worked in London, had to leave the family for half the year. He was a fisherman the other half of the year, and my mother knit orange jumpers. But, within that, there was this wealth of language and imagination. And to grow up in the Gaeltacht is really to find a way of surviving on the back of imagination sometimes.
So it seems so beautifully put, so beautifully articulated. You seem to be saying that within the language itself, in the Irish language, and within poetry, there is vast possibility. and an other world that is possible if we're only able and willing more than able to tune in and listen. Martín, would you agree that from your experience of both poetry and Galician, it offers so much more possibility? For example, it's a place from where the female can be heard clearly, a place where the environment, which I know is one of your specialities, can be heard clearly. Is this something that an encounter with poetry can give us?
I'm fascinated by those connections that you mentioned, and by what Annemarie was saying about growing up in Donegal. In many ways, resonates with my own experience, even though it was a very different one of growing up in constant relationship with the language and to the possibilities of what the language can bring. I'm very much connected to nature as well, and in the aldea where my father was born, and where we spent a very, very long time, and I think that's a connection between the language and nature, which also happens very much in the Irish language, and that kind of vast richness of the way to kind of refer to the land is an awareness that has always been part of my imagination. The way we have so many words for certain aspects of the land, as here for the rain, and we have plenty of words for fields and for. I think there is an attraction for naming, which is part of our tradition, and also part of this tradition here. Like half of the place names of the whole Spain are in Galicia. So there's a kind of a real affection for the names of things and places, of places often that we cannot see because they are underwater, for example. Like the rocks underwater have names, and fishermen they do know the names of every area of the places where they fish. Fountains have names, and fields and small fields and areas of fields where water is plentiful have different names. There's that affinity or that connectivity, I suppose, with language that comes that is kind of very close to nature. That was always part of my upbringing, and in a way of my curiosity about both the natural world and language as a way to inhabit it. I'm going to read a poem that, in a way, tries to capture an element of that. It's a poem called. It's a very long poem. It has two parts, so I'm going to just read the second part. The first part, the poem is called Lugares, which means places. And the first part of the poem deals with places that are far away, that are kind of historical or distant. And the second one tries to kind of, in many ways, recover or restore for my imagination, or in my imagination, for my memory, places that are familiar. In particular, the place where I grew up, and that, I suppose, conform what we may call my sentimental topography of sorts. So I'm going to read it first in Galician, and then I'm going to read it in Keith Payne's English translation, because I'm very fortunate to have Keith as my translator into English. I'm really, really grateful. And there'll be an echo or two of Eliot's here as well. It has always resonated in my head for maybe 40 years now. Estes son os meus lugares propicios para os paseos demorados entre a bruma, o fume branco nas ladeiras fragosas dos Anlois, as éguas bravas internándose na serra, cobertas polo orballo, máis alá un perfil esquivo, o áspero tremuzo. So this is what I saw from my mother's window, basically, that kind of. Os meus lugares, a luz da vila beireada de montañas, unha néboa que ateiga a ría nos días solleiros de outono, o templo, a ponte, a peneda con lapas onde a gaivota, o guindastre, a densa vexetación que ardería ante os meus ollos unha noite de verán, a casa en ruínas. E certamente un sabe que no principio está o fogar, no corazón acaso, no punto de partida, mas toda consideración semella inútil, ilusoria, toda percepción velada ante a evidencia dos afectos. De xeito que as voces das crianzas nas cerdeiras, a follaxe mesta do río, o vento no peirao, as aves mariñas entre rochas son tan só unha forma dos afectos, adición que vai conformando a miña vida, lenta suma de imaxes. Así o poema, envolto no calixeiro que recobre o pálido pasado, os botes varados no río do Porto, o camiño xunto ao mar, con argazo e cunchas esmagadas, o arrecendo da madeira, pequenas cousas que outorgan sentido á miña vida, unha áncora na area comesta polo salitre ao pé do embarcadoiro. Velaquí a relación fragmentaria dos lugares que me cercan, nos que me sinto cativo como unha anguía que esvara na rede sen nunca arelar a fuxida. Velaquí os esteos da miña existencia calmiza, o ronsel dunha gamela, calidade dos afectos. So this is Keith. This Keith's voice, really, that I'm just kind of ventriloquizing here with my own. And these are the perfect places for my restful walks through the mist. White smoke on the slopes, the peaks of St. Lois, the wild mares moving through the mountains under a smell of rain. Beyond, the sloping profile, the rugged Tremuzo. My places, the town ablaze enclosed by rolling hills, the estuary flooded in fog, on autumn's bright days, the church, the bridge, the limpid clung rock with the seagull, the guindastre, the thick scrub that would burn in front of my eyes one summer night, the house in ruins. And there's no doubt in the beginning, home is, in the heart, perhaps, at the very starting point, but every consideration seems pointless, simple fancy, all perception concealed, facing the evidence of the affections. So the voices of the children weaving through the cherry trees, the dense growth on the riverbank, the wind on the pier, the seabirds resting on the rocks, are all forms of affection, addition that conforms to my life, the slow sum of image on image. And so the poem, wrapped in mist, covering the pale past, boats run aground in the Rio do Porto, the path down to the sea with crushed shells and seaweed, the sweet smell of wood, the little things that make sense in my life. A salt's decayed anchor buried in the sand by the pier. Here, the scattered account of the places around me, where I am captive like an eel that slides inside the net and never wants to escape. Here, the pillars of my quiet life, the wake of a launch, the quality of the affection.
Thanks, Martín. And Annemarie, I'll ask you to read a poem in a few moments, but first I would like you to speak to something that we've both spoken about on numerous occasions, which is, so we've established, how the rootedness of a poetry coming from a place and coming from a language that is of that place and the essentialness of that. And we'll address translating that somewhat later. But what I'd like you to talk to us now a bit about, Annemarie, is what can that say to or do for the community, whether it's the local community of the Aldea or the European community in whose building we are today and whose flags align the wall there. Such a rootedness, can it respond to the yearning that we're coming across for human connection in the rooms when we're touring around the country, this tangible yearning that are in the rooms as we go around the place?
Well, I don't think poetry is ever going to go out of fashion. I think, as Audre Lorde said, the civil rights activist, poetry is not a luxury. You know, it's the way by which we bring dreams into fruition and reality. And I feel very lucky that we have this ancient tradition in Ireland. I mean, if you look to the Philly of the medieval period, it was a professionalised job to be a poet, and involved a lot of training. And the poet had a place of esteem in the community. As a recorder of histories, as a petitioner, a satirist, greatly feared sometimes, and also had a closeness or proximity to the other world. And that was signified, of course, by the ceremonial cloak of feathers, known as the tigan. And tigan comes from the word tig, to understand.
Yeah.
The cloak of understanding, of knowledge. So we have a very old tradition of respecting poetry and understanding that poetry has real value.
Yes.
And that is still very present in the consciousness. But I think to really understand that tradition, you have to be reading Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, Biddy Jenkinson, these amazing poets who have carried the line. To some extent, I'm working between languages. I'm weaving English and Irish, but I look to somebody like Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, who says the Irish language is like a plumb line into the subconscious self. You know, and you can really understand the culture through the poetry line. So I think, what can poetry do for us as the world is burning? It's hard to say, isn't it? I mean, can poetry solve any problems directly? Maybe not directly, but it clears a space in which we can hear ourselves and our dreaming, and we can hear the inner world held sacred. And we can be with each other. It's like tuning into a shared frequency. Martin, even as you're reading, I can feel my mind quietening down. And even though I don't know the first language that you're reading in, I'm attuned to the tenderness and the musicality. And there's a peacefulness. There's a sauce that comes. There's a sueñas that comes through.
And we had this experience in Cork with Marwan Makul, the Palestinian poet, who Annemarie arranged to come over to Dublin, Cork and Galway 2 years ago. And again, very few people in the room spoke Arabic. And we got him translated into Gaeilge. And in fact, it was Annemarie who insisted, no, let's translate him, but let's translate him into Irish. And so for that night, that event, we were all enchanted with the encounter of Arabic and Gaeilge, and some Berla, some English spattered through just to keep the attention. But the whole room was able to just sit back and let the song wash over them, and it sent them to all sorts of directions. And so with that in mind, and I am aware that I want to open up the room for a bit of a chat at some stage, you mentioned, Annemarie, working between languages, plumb-lining the native tongue, but so much of any European and wider encounter wouldn't be possible without translation. And so, and Martin, you're a translator, you have been translated, you're also translating, you're working between languages, Annemarie. I came across a wonderful quote the other day from Elliot Weinberger, who said, poetry is that which is worth translating. And I thought, yes, he's got it, absolutely. And then followed with a wonderful book called 19 Ways of Looking at Wang Wei, which is a 1,300-year-old 4-line poem with 19 different versions of it, till Gary Snyder nails it. So translation, What can it's working for us. It's working in our favour. It's a means of the community being heard outside their community, do you think? Annemarie?
Well, it's very contested. I mean, if you're Biddy Jenkinson, she'll say it's a small, rude gesture to want to translate a poem. Why should she have to have her poems translated? And I completely understand that. I mean, I myself am interested in what can be brought, if anything can be brought. Can the beating heart be brought out of one language and into another? I mean, as an exercise, it's just very, very fun to try.
Yeah.
I suppose I love reading poetry in translation. It would be a great shame to me if that wasn't available. I'm glad of the work of translators. I also do understand that a language is a worldview, and I'm not totally convinced that that worldview can always be brought over. And when talking about poetry, the same way you could say this of talking about the Irish language, it's about much more than words, and no language should be reduced to words. The Irish language, for example, is not just a language that we speak in, but it's one that we dream, we intuit, we see, we read, we listen. And so the language is just one aspect. And I suppose we know this as poets. So it's an incredibly skilled job to be a translator and try to bring that world view out of one language into another. And very fun, as I said, but it's not a guarantee that you're going to achieve.
No, but Seamus Heaney was it said, I'm so much better in French. And it's so you're looking, and his translator in Mexico City, she used to look for what can I gain? Even in every point, if I can gain one little thing that maybe wasn't there or that was under the surface. Would you like to read us a poem, Annemarie, in response to?
Sure. I'll read a poem that is about, it's a family poem. So I grew up in a family that fostered children. And fosterage, of course, Althramus is a huge, long tradition in our Irish culture. But this poem remembers a day that a teenage girl was bringing a newborn baby to my mother and handing the child over to my mother. And it did that interesting thing of putting me into the role of child witness, seeing something that I can never forget and all the complications of that. And so I'll read the poem in Irish, first of all, and then I'll read it in English. An Calín Geal. An an gifrú a bhíon, ro anyam ári, mas an chaslan éitir corú na calíní a bheith droblaid, ní ruirt an lunne. Níor bhall an lunne heag an daras seo sália, lasra a fuarga. Bhí si cuig blian a déag, Beiger, fan. Ani a chai an cholly wan jarag sin, no an mé an le a dag mo chiad lian an liascar blian an na yé. Is droch jaltanis an chivne a tad a hir fi vla. Ma hain thu a sha ja le kragan skajal mi an wesh. Ma rakan thu an skajal as an talu mi an wesh. Go jo marin an tavru. Tá si honan leanú a thar a maclan móahar. Is caran gealaí atá maclan móahar. Níl omra bí inis ar an chalín geal. Níl cúniú ar bí agus tan leanú silte, agus an teaga homlan drite fuite dal a bell chalín marú. Ghost Girl. Was it winter? Did she have a name? Nobody said if she came from the castle where the girls in trouble ended up. Nobody brought her here to this threshold, willowy like a flame and yet cold. She was 15 years old, maybe. Wait, was it she who wore that pink dress, or was it I on the day my first lover left me a decade later? Memory is a curse that keeps on flowering. If you enter a home with a hawthorn sprig, death. If you uproot a hawthorn tree, death. Still the image remains. She is about to place her infant in the arms of my mother. My mother's arms are a moon by half. Nobody speaks now of the ghost girl. Nobody grieves and the infant is gone, and the house is all sealed up like a dead girl's mouth.
Thank you so much, Annemarie. I'd like to open to the floor now for a few moments, maybe 5 minutes or so.
We finish by about 10 past 7.
Perfect. That gives us 10 minutes. If anyone would like to make comments or questions or anything at all, or Catriona,
That's my position.
you certainly...
About Gallego.
Excellent.
Can you tell us about Gallego itself, Martín, the language itself? Does it predate what we understand modern Spanish to be? Is it close to modern Spanish, or how does it work?
Well, yeah, so Gallego is a Romance language, and so it evolves from what we call Vulgar Latin, and it's the Latin that was spoken in that area of the Iberian Peninsula. It became known as what it is, roughly speaking, in the Middle Ages, around the 10th century. And it became the language of the kind of fashionable language for poetry from the 12th century to the 15th century all over the peninsula. So poets from like the King of Portugal, the King of Castile, poets from Seville, from all over the peninsula wrote in the Galician Portuguese language. So at that point, both Galician and Portuguese were the same language, and only when Portugal became a state, the languages started to evolve separately. Portuguese became Portuguese as a national language, and Galician became a subaltern language under the domination of Castilian. And gradually, and those ups and downs that I was kind of speaking about earlier have to do with that domination, I suppose, that is that has kind of had an impact in different ways through history, I suppose. So the language in kind of syntactical terms and in terms of vocabulary is closer to Portuguese, very close to Portuguese. So if you read it on a page, and if you know Portuguese, it will be very familiar. Phonetically, it's closer to Spanish. So the pronunciation will be closer to Spanish sounds, I suppose. So that's kind of, I don't know if I answered the question, but kind of, yeah. And then it's widely used. It's widely used. It's very much present. We are now starting to have issues with the generational transmission to the younger speakers. So that is becoming a bit of an issue in the last 15 years, mostly through very conservative linguistic policies by the right government in Spain, in Galicia.
Of course, we have to remember that Spain suffered suppression of all of this.
Very much so.
Minority during Franco's regime.
For a very long time, for a very long time.
That's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah. What Celso Emilio Ferreiro, the Galician poet, called The Long Night of Stone, A Longa Noite de Pedra, which is a book, a poetry collection. And it's worth mentioning that currently the last 4, if not 5, of the national poetry prize winners across Spain, huge, have all been Galician and all been women. Olga Novo being one, who wrote one of my favourite poems, which opens, "Dear Mom, I'm learning to bark." And that kind of takes it from there. Yeah. Anybody else like to come in? Sinead McKay, great to see you.
Thank you both very much. That was wonderful. I wanted to ask Martín about the place names. In Ireland, we have an amazing Irish Place Names Commission. Is there such an entity in Galicia? Are place names being recorded? And a second very quick question is Gallego being taught in schools, or how is the language being preserved from generation to generation? Even if the youngsters are turning away from it, do they have the opportunity to learn it? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sinead. Well, the place names, as I was saying earlier, are part of our ADN or
DNA.
Yeah, sorry,
DNA.
I was trying to think, how is that? Yeah. It's, we grow up surrounded by the richness of that, of I suppose, the wealth of names all around us. They're part of songs. They're part of all sorts of kind of folkloric engagement with the language, include names. So it's they're very much part of our tradition. The language is taught from primary school onwards at every level. So it is, I started with my generation, and it has kind of continued. So from primary school, secondary school, at every level of education, Galician is compulsory. So it's everybody knows how to speak Galician. Not everybody chooses to do it, and that is a different thing. But it's a language that, perhaps because of its proximity with Spanish, it's relatively easy to learn, both in school and in your kind of social environment. So everybody really, or most people, speak Galician. But this is starting to change among the younger population, particularly in the cities, and that is a kind of an issue of concern. The way Galician is taught in schools is also kind of interesting in that it is kind of distributed according to subjects. So certain subjects are taught through the means of Galician, others aren't. And this is a recent thing that they implemented like 15 years ago, and it excludes Galician from being used to teach sciences, for example, which is very concerning.
Yeah. There are no Galician Gael Scullina. You can't. Like my son is 6. Our son is 6, and his native language is Gallego, but he can't go to a school where there's only Gallego spoken. And as Martín said, music and art are taught in Gallego, but the so-called important subjects, sciences, business, mathematics, are taught through Castilian. And so while 50% of the population more or less use it every day, and you could navigate your way through Galicia, your life, using only Gallego, it's for the first time in its modern history has just tipped below the 50, and now they're starting to question the future of it. But so you find, interestingly, Galician literature, if people talk about Galician poetry, Galician literature, that's exclusively written in Gallego, which is interesting. Where we would talk about Irish literature, we actually talk about mostly English. So there's great, really interesting give and take and things to exchange and learn from on both sides. Yeah.
Well, and in that sense, the work that Keith himself has been doing for so long is really exemplary in bringing together the traditions from, particularly related to poetry between Galicia and Ireland, has been doing a huge amount of work, not only in translation but in creating communities. And you were talking earlier about translation and community. I think translation cannot be kind of understood separately. Separately from the idea of relations, and I think about that nearly ecologically, as ecology being a branch of biology that deals with the relations between organisms and the surroundings, and I think that is probably a good definition for translation. How you kind of create these cultural and linguistic spaces of biodiversity through the dialogue that translation enables. And so there is a kind of an ecology of care, of caring for the language that translation really brings to the fore, because it really kind of invites kind of an empathetic kind of engagement with the work of other person to bring it to a different community. So, I think the idea of translation and community cannot be kind of separated. And so I want to thank Keith in public for doing all that work, and to Sinead as well, because Literature Ireland have been doing great work in bringing Irish literature to the world.
And also, we've grown your tools from Skeen Press here, one of the two leading presses, Skeen Press based in Dublin and Boulon Press based out on the Aran Islands, both of whom, and Skeen Press published Louisa Castro's Whales in Wales. And Louisa, in fact, is the new Ligonal of Galicia. I thought about it and looked for an equivalent, and it's Nula. It's a very early Nula. And so Skeen have been championing inward engagement with realizing, yes, we're magnificent, thanks to the work of Sinead and others, of sending our work out. But it needs to be two-way. We need to bring in new voices and other voices in order to bloom and flourish, and for the branches and the roots to get stronger. We could go on for an age, I think, and I think the best thing and the best way to finish these conversations is with a poem. Would you agree? And maybe, Martín, in the Gallego, just the Gallego, we don't need the translation. We can hear the music from the small back room, if you would like. Thank you all so much. Catriona Crowe, thank you so much for bringing us together. Great. And also Fergus and Jeremy and everyone here at the European office.
Thank you, Keith. This is called Milagre de Luz. And it connects, I think, actually with Olga Novo's poem that Keith read earlier, in that it is a poem of inquiry and questioning. Milagre de luz. Quen lle dixo que non esta noite ao vento? Quen abriu as portas dun alboio de táboas? Quen estendeu unha pátina de neve sobre os tellados de lousa, nos recantos máis escuros dos xardíns traseiros? Quen deixou prendida a lúa, pendurada no alto, como unha bágoa alegre, entre as torres da igrexa? Quen sentiu a respiración vexetal das flores ventureiras, que ao sol do inverno, ávidas do fulgor do día, renden o corazón como un milagre de luz? Quen lles a pechar ao empardecer os ollos, sen poñer nas súas pálpebras peniques? Quen contempla desde a fiestra o tránsito do río, o tránsito da vida que sen pausa recomeza? Quen é esa sombra líquida que en silencio escorrega furtiva á beira das aceas, nos ocos da limacha? Quen soñou o devalar das horas, o frío, os rastros do poema? Graciña.